All right, hopefully everybody can see that, right? All right, so today's class will be about what is religion, and I'm Jeremy Fricke, of course. I know I see a lot of familiar faces as well as some new faces. I just want to start with a couple of announcements. So one announcement is we're going to actually change the base name of the class. You know, it's currently Interfaith Learning. We're actually going to change it to Abraham's Whiteboard. And that's partially because the majority of people who join are from Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, and I often will teach in a way that will connect it to Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, even if it's about traditions that are not represented. And also, I do want to mention that our next class will be led by our program director at Tri-Faith, Amanda Ryan, to talk about the sociology of religion. So we're going to go through a few different things, and I hope that you learn a little bit about each of these four main goals. Where does the idea of religion come from? How has the idea of religion adapted over time? How has it changed? And does thinking about what the category of religion means impact how we view ourselves? And basically throughout today's program, I'd like you to think about, what does religion mean to you? And feel free to respond to that question in the chat now. And we'll kind of revisit that later in the program. All right, so I'm gonna have a few little housekeeping things because this is a very broad topic and I wanna make sure that it's understood what I'm talking about today. So there are a lot of ways that we can respond to the question, what is religion, right? It's not just even definitions, it's about, how do we even think about it in the first place? There are what I would consider four main ways that people think about what religion is or how they define it. Theology, which is often what you will get at your religious institutions. Linguistic, which is kind of the way of how language has changed, which is a little bit of what we're going to do today. Sociological, which is what Amanda Ryan will do next month. And then the psychological or scientific, kind of the scientific processes that we can look at for the ways that religion interacts with our lives. So a couple of caveats here. So again, even just this specific topic is so big, I'm not going to be able to go into every little detail that is totally deserving of what we can give it. But what I hope is that we kind of spur you to look into some of these other issues a little bit further if you're interested. I also want to mention that language, even though we will be talking about language today, language changes and it's always perceived a little different person to person. We can talk about definitions of a word today, but two people might still understand those words very differently. So anything I say is going to be kind of a generalization about these words, but hopefully, we see that there's a tendency of defining in certain ways. I also want to mention that this area of understanding religion does tend to be more Western and more male-focused. This is partially just because of how the field has adapted over time. It's been a little slower. But we will have a stronger focus on that, on other voices in other classes. And then also, there's religion and spirituality. And in this class, I'm not going to divide them. I'm not really going to pay a whole lot of attention to the word spirituality or the ideas of spirituality. We're just going to be talking about religion today. All of the things that I talk about could be discussed in the context of spirituality, but just for the sake of time, we'll focus on religion today. So again, what does religion mean to you? And we're going to go through a variety of ways, the variety of ways that religion has been looked at by groups of people and by individuals over a long time here. So firstly, let's talk a little bit about Judaism and the idea of religion. So I think it's important to recognize that religion itself, the idea of religion, has changed, adapted, and been different over time, all the time. But there are times in our history where religion itself doesn't necessarily have a word associated with it. A lot of what we consider religious doesn't necessarily have a word with it. So in my understanding, Judaism is more about the peoplehood of Jewish people. So it's very community centric. And at this, and we're talking about like the Hebrew biblical times. Okay, I want to back off a little bit. So during these times, the ideas of culture and religion, ethnicity, even geographic area, those things are all tied up in a way that is not necessarily true today. We talk today about intersectional identities. Well, often in these, the farther back you go, these identities are wrapped up in each other in less defined ways. So ancient Judaism didn't have a clear word that separated religion from things like culture or just the idea of being Jewish. The idea that there are many religions wasn't really something that was discussed in the Hebrew Bible. And I do want to mention also that the term Judaism literally translates to those who are with the Judeans. I think I also want to mention here that Judaism has always had, to some extent, conversions. It's just been different over time. There are many ways to think about a process of joining a religion or a community. And at least in my vision of ancient Judaism, the conversion process looks more like an adoption into a community, rather than kind of the Christian conversion concept. All right, so the first time we really hear a word that's related to religion is religio, and it's a Latin word, used in the Roman Empire times, and it literally means to bind. So, while you're thinking about this, what does your religion bind you to? Whether that, whether that tends to be, a community or certain feelings or certain ideas. I also think it's important to see that, so Cicero, who wrote a ton, of course, in the late Roman Empire, he related religio to superstitio, which, is religion and superstition. But he says that basically religion is fear of God, in a sense, and superstition is too much fear of God. That's an oversimplification, but it's very interesting to me that he compares the two. And then we move forward into Islam. So I'm going to go a little bit in chronological order throughout this. But in Islam, we see what I would consider some of the earlier forms of more modern ideas of religion. And in Islam, it's called deen. So the religion of Islam is called Deen al-Islam. And this is translated a whole bunch of different ways. There's actually a scholar named Talal Asad who actually really looks at Islam as why we need to think a little more clearly about what we mean by religion, because the term deen means more than the term religio. It often is translated to law or customs or religion, and it's related to the word for judgment or court in Hebrew. But one of the most popular definitions is indebtedness. So it's kind of an emphasis on sort of the humility and service that an individual would give to Islam. And I'll just read this quote here, because this is one area in the Hadith, which is an Islamic text that talks a little bit about deen. So the Prophet said, peace be upon him, religion or deen is very easy, and whoever overburdens himself in his religion will not be able to continue in that way. So you should not be extremists, but try to be near to perfection and receive the good things that you will be rewarded, and gain strength by worshiping in the mornings or the nights. So there is a little more encompassing view of kind of what religion or world religions might be in early Islam, even in the earliest texts. So now 900 years are passing, up until the 15th century. And as I've mentioned before, the idea with language is that it is always changing. It can change between people, it can change over time. And, but the term religio slowly became the idea of very specifically the monks or nuns, particularly in the Catholic Church. And you will hear this in a lot of Catholic circles as well, that the religious is a way to refer to the monks and the nuns in particular. And it started to be defined in some kind of early dictionaries as discipline. So kind of this repeated course, this practice that you need to repeat every day and focus and bring to a daily part of your life. So now that's to give you kind of a background before really religion started really modernizing. Okay, the idea today is a very modern idea. The idea that people have religions. Before this time in general, we have religion. You have people who have religion or they don't, in most people's point of view. So in early Christianity, religion would have been Christianity. And others are not seen as part of that. That's just how they use the word. But during the age of exploration, we get very new ideas about religion. People are going around the world, and honestly, in particular, meeting indigenous people or people who they did not know existed before. And they are, to some extent, seeking whether, and again, in general, this is kind of a Christian-centric time period. They're trying to see whether these people are already Christian. And they really define it as religion. But as they meet people, they see some similarities with themselves. And with some people, they believe that they have some religion or they don't. And a conquistador who was traveling around trying to proselytize, said of the indigenous people of the Americas that he observed no religion at all as they understand it, nor is there any house of worship to be found. Now, I do want to mention that both of those are untrue by virtually any definition of those two things. You know, that there's both religious aspects by almost any definition, as well as houses of worship by almost any definition. But at this time, you know, they were looking for a very, very specific form of what religion might be. And this is 1553 for this specific quote. Now, religion in the Enlightenment era, this is as we move forward, there's this idea again where you have religion, you have one religion, and other people either have parts of it or nothing, or something like that. There aren't alternative religions until the Enlightenment era. Now, but it's very important to see that, so during the Enlightenment era, as many of you may have learned about in the past, there started to be more of an emphasis on this kind of abstract religion, where there's a God, and the God made science and logic and basically the spirit of humanity, but the rest of the stories are not something that they are interested in getting into detail with. So they start to say, well, if these other people who consider themselves other things, and at this time we clearly have a strong presence of Muslims. I mean, both positive and negative relations have happened. But if they have, a God, and they have some interest in logic and the spirit of humanity, then they must be their own religion too. So the first step is that there is a recognition that Christianity, Judaism, and Islam are considered religions. They are given to some extent an equal-ish status to each other with the term religion. And again, this is the first time. Before this, they would have considered other Abrahamic traditions to be heresies. But this starts to change as time goes on and as these relationships are found. And throughout the Enlightenment era, we have a huge rise in scholarship of all kinds, right? We have anthropology, we have religious studies, we have sociology and psychology that are booming in this era, and they start to slowly expand the tent, if you will. That, well, so we started with, if they have a God and they have logic and spirit, then they are religion. Well, what happens when we have a group who looks a lot like, Christianity, for example, where we have a particular religious figure and they have clear teachings that they claim are from God or something like God, maybe gods. Do those still count as religions, right? So fairly early on, we have an adoption of Buddhism and Hinduism also into the idea of what religion is. And again, this continues to expand, and we see the growth of what we call the world's religions. So, you may assume that the idea of world's religions has been an eternal thing, or something that has been around even for many hundreds of years. But that idea is pretty new, and this continues to develop a little bit, as we'll see. So I want to mention who is kind of considered one of the sort of fathers of the idea of world religions and of religious studies in general. Because if I can kind of move away from it for a second, religious studies means that we can study religion and religions, right? That there are multiple things to study that are religion. So he really emphasizes the idea that in his view, there is basically one God, and there are different languages that talk about this same God. Now his religion, I believe, was theosophy technically, which is a kind of universalistic, monotheistic religion. But he believed that language was the way to understand people of different religious backgrounds. And so his quote here is, "The only scientific and genetic classification of religions is the same as the classification of languages." So again, he would say that you should study religion by the language. So you'd have Semitic religions, you'd have religions from Indo-Aryan languages, things like that. So just to kind of summarize, so this is late 19th century, and we're starting to get the idea of world religions. Now, I just want to recap. For hundreds of years, religion was not a self-imposed title, but it is today. And I think we should recognize that matters. Like, just because it didn't start that way doesn't mean it's not important today. A lot of things change over time. And sometimes it's just because we finally find the words to describe what we're trying to describe. Number two, there has always been a sense that religion has a deep connection to being human. So even in some of these earliest, so either whether we look at it in the positive or negative way, I'll start with the negative. The negative way is, a lot of the time religion, if you were seen as participating in religion, you would be fully human. And if you were not, you would be seen as less than. And then over time, we start to be more accepting of people, little by little, as we go. And even today, I would argue that most of us feel or believe that most people have some kind of religion, even if it's kind of a smaller or bigger part of their life, or maybe it's not named, something along those lines. And then number three, with other religions, there's always something familiar. So when we see ourselves as religious, and we see others as religious, we see the sorry, I have a chihuahua. We see the similarities, right? So, when they started to really recognize that Judaism and Islam were also religions, then they could really dive into those similarities. And then also, religion has almost always included both beliefs and behavior. So it's both a mind thing and a way that we engage with the world. All right. So I do want to also ask, if anyone feels brave. Otherwise, I'll just keep going on. But I would be interested in hearing whether, if religion was defined based on the religion that you are a part of, how would you think it would be defined? So in many ways, I'll just talk a little bit while you're thinking a little bit. the very early Christianity, Christianity-focused religion was very focused on the idea that they would have a God, and they would have some kind of answer for death. And they would preferably probably have a book. But I would be interested in if anyone would like to be brave and say what you would think if you were to define the idea of religion from your own religious path, how would it be defined? Would anyone like to?
I would make a comment.
Yeah, of course.
My name's David Glenn.
Mm-hmm.
I would say that there is only one religion, and that is the Word of God.
Okay.
And the Word of God has been expressed to many peoples over time in differing social and life situations. So we see differences based on different needs of their time and where they lived, but it's all been an expression of our Creator to the humanity that He created and loves and is educating and nurturing and loving.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to add?
Hi, I'm Lori. I guess I look at it as that religion's that set of rules, rituals of understanding that give order to life.
Okay. Okay.
That's kind of where more the things I do.
Yeah, no, that's a good answer.
I had my audio muted. So, David, I was going to say, I wish I'd been raised with that philosophy. I was raised with the philosophy that religion was about the revealed word of God. And it was very rules-oriented. And it was not my rules. It was somebody else knew all the answers, and I did not. And it was a lifetime of studying to find the answers, apparently, that other people had already found, because they really weren't encouraging me to find my own.
Well, thank you all for your answers there. Is there one more? Okay. So as you know, there are many definitions of religion from many walks of life, and I think it's important to mention here also that, you know, in sort of academic circles, there's debates about even whether the term religion is helpful. Now, I'm of the persuasion that it is, but if we all define religion differently, you know, what are we talking about, right? If we don't have a shared definition. Now, I think there's something about religion that that we can sort of see or sort of feel without necessarily always defining it. But I do want to go through three main definitions that I see as inspiring a lot of how people think about religion today. Okay. So many of you have probably heard of William James and the varieties of religious experience. So William James was mostly a scholar in the 19th and early 20th century, and he is kind of the grandfather of what we might think about with American religion, especially American religious studies, the way of studying religion from kind of an American perspective. Now, I'll just read this one. And I would love for someone brave to be willing to read the next couple when we go through them. So, religion is the feelings, acts, and experiences of individual men in their solitude, so far as they apprehend themselves to stand in relation to whatever they may consider the divine. So, what do you notice about this definition? What do you think is missing? What do you think is particularly valuable?
Solitude versus sociological aspect.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point. What else? Anybody else?
This is Kathy. Mm-hmm. Why did you not bold men? Because it's pretty obvious to me that it's meant to be men, not women. Is that correct?
Right. I mean, now this is my interpretation, is that 19th century scholar men like to use that as a encompassing term, but you may be right. I don't know enough about William James to know whether he would have perceived religiosity in women. I think he would have, but I don't know for sure. That is a good point. And that's definitely a big part of language again, right? We're talking about how languages change a little bit. So like, I'm sorry, I'm trying to find your name here. Well, there's a brash individualism, right? This is a very individualistic sense, right? There's actually no expectation of community whatsoever in this. There's no expectation of a book. There's no expectation of a building. There's no expectation of like leaders or anything along those lines. It's really just the emotional experience that people have with whatever they consider the divine when they're by themselves. I think that probably speaks to some people in certain contexts, but probably not all the time, right? And then, would anyone like to volunteer to read Emile Durkheim's 2 definitions?
I'll volunteer, Jeremy.
Okay, thank you.
This is Michelle. A religion is a unified system of beliefs and practices relative to sacred things, that is to say, things set apart and forbidden. Beliefs and practices which unite into one single moral community called a church, all those who adhere to them. Religion is the self-validation of a society by means of myth and ritual.
All right. So who would like to tell me what they particularly notice about this? What's different? What's the same?
This is Carrie Pratt. Do you mind if I chime in without my video on?
Sure. Sorry, I accidentally muted you. I will tell you that your voice is very off, but please let me know what you think.
I'll be brief. I just think it's interesting, the difference between the individual sense of religion and this community sense of religion. Because I've had an interesting experience myself during COVID-19, as I haven't been able to worship with other people. And I found that for me, there are both aspects, right, of religion, right, like being bound to the divine and then also being bound to that religious community.
Right. So that's a really interesting point, that I didn't think about that much. Sometimes I never really forget that we're in coronavirus, but sometimes I forget that it affects the things I love to learn and teach about, right? There's no doubt, right? So like when we're talking about community building, how do we define religious community? as we are separated, right? I think that's a good point. Obviously, also he uses the term church. You know, he's a Christian guy. He's using that in a kind of loose way. You know, it's a term for religious institution to him. But you know, this is beliefs and practices, and I think something that's particularly important about this is he makes a separation between two things in our lives, right? The things that are religious and the things that are not, right? He says those that are set apart and forbidden. So, you know, a lot of people might say that, you know, gardening, right? I think a lot of people in the Tri-Faith garden absolutely love the garden and do feel some level of religious commitment or religious fulfillment from even just working with the garden. But my understanding of this is that might not count to Durkheim. Now, that doesn't mean that it's true, but this is the problem we always come across with religion, right? With defining religion. So, you know, in some ways we can say it is those things set apart, right? We set a specific day for religious ritual, or we have certain holidays, we have a certain space where we do these things, and we don't really do other things other than religion in those spaces or places. And, you know, but one thing that he gets that James clearly didn't, that Carrie mentioned, is that there's a strong community aspect. Both his definitions are very much, and he's using, I understand community and society to mean the same thing in this, but the way that a community solidifies itself by means of what they believe and what they practice, right? And that's from the Elementary Forms of the Religious Life, which is another very, very foundational text of studying religion. All right, so who would like to volunteer to read Clifford Geertz?
This is Sarah. I can read here. Religion is a system of symbols which acts to establish powerful, persuasive, and long-lasting moods and motivations by formulating conceptions of a general order of existence and clothing these conceptions with such an aura of factuality that the moods and motivations seem uniquely realistic. Boy, isn't that a mouthful?
Yeah. He's hard to read.
I shouldn't have laughed in the middle, but I'm like, whoa.
I get it. There's a lot of conceptions.
There's a lot there, but I'm not knocking it. It's a you know. Anyway, I'll let somebody else talk.
Yeah, I mean, so what do people notice about this definition that's different or the same from the others? What is it missing? What does it have that's special? And I know this one's harder to read. But
I think the system of symbols is huge in this. You know, of course, he starts out with that, but also it's this. You know, I suppose, you know, with Durkheim, the church in a sense is a symbol, but otherwise, you know, we have different symbols in different faiths, and I think it extends that whole idea, which really hasn't been alluded to before. And let's see, a general order of existence, it kind of binds together the ideas we talked before about the shared belief systems that are unique to each religion or, you know, point of view. I guess we're talking about religion, so we'll say religion. But anyway, that is really a mouthful though, isn't it?
Yeah, no, for sure. I I mean, one thing that I want to add to this in particular is, so the other two are very much about the person, right? That the religion. So if we're thinking about where is religion located, right? James puts it in individuals, right? That's where religion is found. Durkheim is in one single moral community or a society or a church. And with Geertz, he's saying it's located in the symbols, right? Yeah.
I was going to say, I have been reading or rereading a book by Herman Wouk called Who is My God?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if anyone's read it, but it's just filled with so many interesting concepts. And one quote he has is that symbol is reality distilled. And I can ponder that for a long time. So yeah, like Sarah said, that was one of the first things I noticed in this one, that set of symbols, which kind of makes it sound like it's not reality as much, but according to Woke, it's reality. It is reality. And so he goes on, and I'd have to reread this too several times to even understand it, but such as an aura of these conceptions with such an aura of factuality that the moods and motivations seem uniquely realistic. Well, maybe that is what the symbols are, actually. They are reality distilled. I just love that.
Yeah, I mean, I would love for you to put the book name in the chat if you can. That does sound like very much like a better written or maybe more poetically written version of this.
The whole book is poetic. In fact, I wanted to know more about Judaism, so I went on some website. I found Ask a Rabbi, and I'm not having been brought up in Judaism at all. And this was one of the books that was recommended. And just the way he writes, even whether you want to get into the subject matter or not, but it's quite beautiful. Yes, I'll put it in the chat section.
Thank you. Yeah, so I mean, I think it's important to note that this definition, the uniquely realistic piece, is not, it should be understood as like kind of real beyond real, right? Mm-hmm. Sort of this thing that represents something so real that it is uniquely real beyond the regular everyday things that we do. Right. That's a major part of what makes it religious, is that it tends to that realism that is hard to really get in touch with. And just to the general order of existence, we can look at that a lot of different ways, but I would say that generally is talking about how we understand relationships with everything. That's a really big, a general order of existence. What's our relationship to the planet? What's our relationship to people? What's our relationship to ourselves? But again, he centralizes the symbols, not the people. I would be interested in, does anyone have a particular thought on, if, again, I kind of asked this earlier, if you were to define religion based on your own, how would you define it? Well, if you were to understand your religion through one of these definitions, what would you be looking at, right? Like, does learning about ways to think about the idea of religion help you to see basically the beauty within different parts of your own? Those individual experiences in solitude, those very feeling-centered things, the the unification and community aspect of religion, the way that people make sure that they are all in this together by their religious community, and then those shared symbols. Yeah, I would love to hear if anyone has any thoughts about that for, for their own religious tradition. Or if anyone has a favorite, I would like to hear any of that.
Jeremy,
Yeah.
I was struck with Durkheim's when he started to talk of the one single moral community, because I think that's one of the ways that I experience religions kind of controlling people, not in a good way, and kind of defining who is good and who is bad. And so that moral community moves into a sense of judgment.
Oh, okay.
And
yeah.
That's what jumped out there.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's important to recognize also, if we have a universal definition of religion, it would need to speak to both those positive and negative experiences with religion, right? Well, any other thoughts on that? All right. Let's see. And I'd also like to know, and I mentioned this earlier, has your personal definition of religion changed? I asked you at the beginning to kind of think about or type out what your definition of religion might be. Do you think that it has changed at all? And if not, that's fine. There are a wide variety, and there are, if you were to get a group of 10 people who love religion, whether they're theologians or academics or whatever, you would probably get about 50 definitions of religion, right? Because it depends on what aspects we're trying to look at.
I think my definition of religion has changed dramatically. I would say I went from a William James kind of point of view to very Durkheimian, if that's a real word, just because I don't know how much of a moral person I am in terms of claiming to be part of the moral community. I do understand the previous comments, and I understand that, but just in terms of the fellowship, and I think the change that came in me, these things always evolve, but our pastor, Eric, put it so beautifully. He said, just as God calls us to be in relationship with him, he calls us to be in relationship with others. And ever since I've done that, my world has just been so much richer. I almost think of Emerson or something when I think of William James, and then I guess Geertz, isn't he like a father of anthropology? Anyway, he's an anthropologist, right? Yes. I just remember reading about him in school, and I know I have some background in philosophy, so I know the other two guys are philosophers. But anyway, I would say that's a 180. Those first two are a 180. The kind of, I shouldn't call William James a navel gazer. But you know what I'm saying? They're just so completely different. So I would say, yes, I definitely have. I don't know if I evolved, but I've changed.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah. Would anyone else like to add? I'll tell you, my personal favorite is Geertz myself. And it's mostly because I think it's, I find religion in the symbols. I think that's me. Of course, I personally don't have a religious community, for myself. So that might be part of it as well. But I don't know. All right. Well, I'm actually, this is basically what I had. So this is going to be a little shorter class than normal. But if anyone has any questions, I'm glad to glad to respond. I do want to remind also, next month will be led by Amanda Ryan on the sociology of religion. And I also want to remind that the name of this series is going to change. It'll be Abraham's Whiteboard instead. It'll be the same basic, basic idea behind it, but it just needed to be honestly, a little better branded, so people know it has to do with Tri-Faith Initiative and kind of have an idea of what to look for. So these three things on the right here, Religion, Religions, Religious by J.Z. Smith. That's an article that can be found for free. And that is the one that I would suggest people to read if they're going to read one. It's not going to go into those last three people. It's going to go into most of the information from before. Almost anything on this topic is pretty dense to read, though. So I'll tell you that right now. If you are interested, you'll have to be patient because most of it is pretty academic. Before Religion by Brent Nongbre, he is making an argument mostly that religion is not helpful as a term. But what he does is he looks at those words like deen, right? And looks at them more deeply to try to explain why deen should be just called deen. It shouldn't be called religion in his view. And then Genealogies of Religion, also very academic, but that one is also very interesting if you like this type of conversation. And then I also have a survey. Let me stop sharing my screen here. Yeah, so in the chat, I'm gonna share the survey. Oh, wait, whoops. All right, so I'm gonna share the survey there. And, I would love for you to fill out the survey, let me know what I can improve or whether you enjoyed it or didn't enjoy it or anything like that. And since you registered, you're gonna receive kind of a recap email, and it'll have the link to this video as well as probably the slides. So if there are no other questions, then I think you are free to go.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you.